One of the driest, most lifeless places on Earth sits in North Africa, the Sahara, vast, empty, and hostile to almost everything that tries to live in it. Nothing about it hints at what it used to be. Around 100 million years ago, this same ground was covered by one of the largest river systems on the planet. Wide channels, dense floodplains, water stretching as far as anything alive could see, and that river was full, not just with life, but with predators. More predators packed into one place than almost anywhere else in the fossil record. In every ecosystem we know of, predators are rare. They have to be. A healthy system needs far more prey than hunters. That is the rule that holds everything together. This river broke that rule completely. At least 4 massive predatory dinosaurs shared this system at the same time, not separated by distance, not separated by millions of years. The same water, the same banks, the same hunting grounds, overlapping, competing, somehow coexisting in a system that by every rule we understand should have collapsed. But it did not collapse. It held for a long time. And at the center of it was one animal unlike anything else sharing that river, Spinosaurus, longer than a city bus, heavier than an elephant, and built completely differently from every other large predator of its time, in ways that took scientists decades to begin to understand, and that still have not been fully explained. It was not built for land. Everything about its body points somewhere else entirely, and the more closely it has been studied, the stranger it becomes, because what it suggests about how this animal lived does not fit neatly into any category we have. But how did one animal come to dominate a system already crowded with giants, and how did that system survive at all? Tonight, we go back to the river and find out. If you enjoy content like this, calm and relaxing, I would appreciate it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Get comfortable. We are going back 100 million years. There is a way to read the distant past not as a sequence of events, but as a shifting arrangement of land, water, and heat, slowly reorganizing itself over spans of time, too large to hold all at once. Around 100 million years ago, during the long middle stretch of the Cretaceous period, the Earth settled into one of these arrangements, a configuration that no longer exists, but still lingers in fragments beneath stone. The continents had not yet reached their present positions. Africa and South America, once tightly joined, had only recently begun to part, their edges separating along a widening seam that would become the Atlantic. The distance between them remained narrow compared to today, and their coastlines still echoed one another in shape. To the north, a broad expanse of shallow water known as the Tethys extended across what is now southern Europe and into North Africa, feeding moisture into the land and linking ocean systems that are now isolated. The climate held more warmth than the present world. Ice was limited and sea level stood higher, allowing ocean water to spill across low regions of the continents. In many places, the boundary between land and sea blurred into wide, shallow basins. These conditions shaped the flow of water across North Africa, where the ground lay close to sea level and responded easily to seasonal change. In that setting, the region that would become the Sahara bore little resemblance to its modern form. Instead of dry expanses, the land supported a broad deltaic plain, fed from the north by the retreating edge of the Tethys and draining westward toward the young Atlantic. The terrain remained low and gently contoured, allowing water to spread across it rather than carve deeply into it. Sediment moved with each shift and flow, building and reshaping the surface in quiet, continuous motion. Across this plain, the Kem Kem system took form as an extended network rather than a single defined river. Channels divided and rejoined, some wide and slow, others narrow and shifting, creating a pattern that changed over time but remained centered on the movement of water across the land. Between these channels lay floodplains and wetlands, areas where water lingered long enough to sustain dense biological activity. Sandbars formed where currents slowed, then dissolved again when flow increased. The climate followed a cycle governed by seasonal monsoon patterns. Moist air moved inland at certain times of year, bringing intense rainfall that filled the channels and spread outward across the plains. During these periods, the system expanded, connecting separate waterways into a continuous surface. Nutrients stirred within the sediment and entered circulation, supporting a surge in aquatic life that grew rapidly under these conditions. As the rains passed, evaporation and drainage reduced the water level, breaking the surface into smaller, more isolated channels and pools. This alternating pattern of expansion and contraction shaped both the landscape and the living systems within it. The river did not remain constant, but its rhythm was predictable, and life adapted to that rhythm in ways that would leave lasting traces. Those traces are preserved today within the Kem Kem group, a sequence of sedimentary layers exposed along an escarpment that runs across parts of Morocco and Algeria. Each layer records a moment of deposition, a settling of material carried by water and left behind as conditions shifted. Within these layers lie fossils that represent a wide range of organisms, captured not as complete scenes, but as fragments distributed through the rock. Taken together, they form one of the most detailed records of a Cretaceous ecosystem in Africa. The pattern that emerges from them is not immediately familiar, and as more pieces are examined, the structure they suggest begins to diverge from the balance commonly observed in living systems today. If a living system could be reduced to a quiet equation, it would resolve into a simple shape, one that narrows as it rises. Energy enters at the base in vast quantities, then diminishes with each step upward, leaving only a small fraction available for those at the top. This pattern is not imposed from outside. It emerges naturally from loss, from the inefficiency of every transfer. In almost every environment studied, this gradual thinning holds steady, forming a structure that rarely deviates. The record preserved in this ancient river system suggests something different. Within the layers of stone, the remains of predators appear with unusual frequency, enough to alter the expected proportions. Carnivorous species do not occupy a narrow peak here. They fill much of the visible distribution. Careful counts of identifiable fossils indicate that close to 70% belong to animals adapted for hunting, a ratio that shifts the familiar structure into something broader and less constrained. Such a pattern invites a slower reading. Sediment gathers over long spans, collecting traces from many moments and merging them into a single surface. This process, known as time averaging, can compress thousands of years into one layer, allowing species that never lived side by side to appear together in stone. The river's deposits hold this blending within them, a quiet accumulation that can give the illusion of overlap where separation once existed. Even when allowance is made for this effect, the density of large carnivores remains striking. Adjustments soften the edges of the pattern, yet they do not remove its core. The number of predators, especially those of considerable size, exceeds what most systems can support under ordinary conditions. The imbalance persists, suggesting that the underlying environment operated with a different distribution of energy. The source of that difference lies beneath the surface, where the movement of water sustained an unusually large and consistent population of fish. This aquatic layer did not fluctuate in the same way as many modern systems. It expanded and contracted with seasonal change, yet it returned each time with substantial volume. Nutrients circulated through the channels and floodplains, feeding a cycle of growth that replenished itself with each passing phase. Within this setting, fish reached dimensions that reshape expectation. Coelacanths moved through deeper reaches with a steady, unhurried motion, carrying a lineage that extended far into the past. Even then, lungfish occupied quieter zones, their biology allowing them to persist through shifts that would limit other species. Alongside them lived forms built on a more imposing scale, including a large saw-bearing fish whose extended snout carried rows of hardened projections. Individuals could reach lengths of 8 to 9 meters, their presence altering the space around them simply by moving through it. This sustained abundance allowed multiple predatory strategies to exist without immediate conflict. Hunters could draw from the same resource without exhausting it, each interacting with the river in a slightly different way. The usual narrowing of the ecological structure relaxed, not entirely removed, but widened enough to support a higher number of large carnivores than would otherwise be possible. Over time, the animals that lived here became shaped by this condition. Their forms reflect a system where opportunity remained high, and competition, though present, did not compress every niche into scarcity. The pattern preserved in the fossils does not mirror the balance seen in most environments today. Instead, it records a variation, a configuration sustained by a steady and abundant source of energy moving through water, leaving behind a structure that continues to stand apart when examined closely. Some animals are understood the moment their shape is seen, their structure fitting neatly into patterns already familiar. Others resist that clarity, their form carrying signals that do not align, requiring years of careful study before a coherent image begins to settle. The creature known as Spinosaurus aegyptocus belongs to the latter, its anatomy unfolding slowly across more than a century of discovery. It first entered scientific record in 1915, described by the German paleontologist Ernst Stromer from remains uncovered in Egypt. Even in those early fragments, its proportions suggested something unusual, though the full extent of that difference would remain obscured for decades. As additional material emerged and comparisons deepened, its scale became clearer. Estimates place its length between 14 and 15 meters, with a mass approaching 7 tons, extending beyond the size of any known Tyrannosaurus rex. Yet size alone does not define its distinctiveness. The arrangement of its body departs from the familiar structure seen in other large theropods. Its hind limbs are noticeably shortened, reducing the height and stride expected of a terrestrial hunter. The bones themselves carry an unexpected density, a heaviness that alters how the body interacts with water. Along the spine, elongated structures rise to support a tall sail, while at the rear, the tail expands into a broad, flexible surface, unlike the stiff balancing tails of its relatives. Clarity began to sharpen in 2014 when Nizar Ibrahim and his colleagues described new material that revealed the tail in detail for the first time. Rather than a narrow extension, it appeared laterally flattened, forming a shape that could move water efficiently when swept from side to side. The structure resembles an oar more than a counterweight, suggesting active propulsion rather than passive balance. This single feature reshaped the interpretation of the entire animal, aligning it more closely with aquatic motion than with terrestrial stability. The density of its bones supports this direction. This condition, known as pachyostosis, is observed in animals that spend significant time submerged. Increased bone mass reduces buoyancy, allowing the body to remain below the surface with less effort. In Spinosaurus, this trait appears throughout the skeleton, creating a form that would sink more readily than that of a typical land predator. The skull extends forward in a long, narrow profile, its shape recalling modern crocodilians, Along its surface, the nostrils sit higher than in most dinosaurs, positioned in a way that would allow breathing while the majority of the head remained beneath the waterline. The jaws carry conical teeth suited to gripping rather than slicing, their form consistent with capturing prey that moves through fluid rather than across open ground. Taken together, these features form a consistent pattern. Movement on land would have been limited, the shortened hind limbs and forward shifted weight, reducing efficiency over distance. In water, however, the same traits align into a coherent system. The tail provides thrust, the dense bones stabilize the body, and the skull configuration supports feeding at the surface, or just below it. Each element, considered in isolation, might suggest a partial adaptation. Combined, they point in a single direction toward an animal shaped by life within a river environment. The body does not resemble that of a land predator that occasionally enters water. Instead, it reflects a form built primarily for aquatic movement, with the ability to emerge onto land when necessary, but not to depend on it. Understanding this structure required time, as early interpretations placed the animal within familiar categories that did not fully fit. With each new discovery, those assumptions shifted, replaced by a model that better reflects the evidence preserved in bone. The result is a creature whose anatomy stands apart from others of its kind, its form aligned with a mode of life that for much of the last century remained difficult to recognize. Small fragments often carry a quieter kind of certainty, one that does not rely on shape or scale, but on repetition. Scattered through sediment, worn by time and transport, they accumulate in ways that reflect presence rather than appearance. Among all fossil remains, teeth endure with particular resilience, resisting decay and preserving a record that builds slowly, layer by layer. For years, the structure of Spinosaurus suggested a life tied closely to water, yet interpretation left space for doubt. Form can be read in more than one way, and without direct evidence of behavior, conclusions remain provisional. What was needed was not another skeleton, but a pattern grounded in accumulation, something that could reveal where the animal spent most of its time rather than how it might have moved. In 2020, a team from the University of Portsmouth approached this question through a different kind of dataset. Instead of focusing on large bones, they collected fossilized teeth from the Kem Kem deposits, gathering more than 1,200 individual specimens. Each tooth represented a moment lost from a living animal, replaced during growth and left behind within the sediment. Over time, these losses build into a measurable record, one that reflects how frequently a species occupied a particular environment. Dinosaurs, like many reptiles, replace their teeth continuously. A single individual could shed dozens over its lifetime, each one falling into the surrounding landscape. Where an animal remained for extended periods, those teeth accumulated in higher numbers. Where it passed through only occasionally, the record remains sparse, marked by absence as much as by presence. When the collected teeth were sorted and identified, a clear pattern emerged. Nearly half of the entire sample, approximately 45%, belonged to Spinosaurus. This proportion exceeded that of all other species found within the same deposits, including those fully adapted to aquatic life. The distribution did not align with the idea of a visitor or a transient hunter moving along the edges. It reflected sustained occupancy, a continuous presence within the system. In contrast, teeth from primarily terrestrial dinosaurs appeared only in small numbers. Their rarity suggested limited interaction with the river environment, consistent with animals that approached the water for specific purposes, but did not remain within it. The difference between these patterns formed a quiet but decisive contrast, one that could not be easily attributed to chance or preservation bias. This approach draws from the principles of taphonomy, the study of how organisms become fossilized and how their remains are distributed within geological contexts. By examining not just what is found, but how often it appears, taphonomy allows patterns of behavior to emerge from otherwise isolated fragments. In this case, it provided a way to move beyond anatomical inference and toward a more direct understanding of lifestyle. The accumulation of Spinosaurus teeth within these sediments indicates more than repeated visits. It points to an existence centered within the river itself, where feeding, movement, and daily activity occurred. The environment did not serve as a boundary or a resource at the edge of its range. It formed the core of its habitat, the place where its life unfolded from beginning to end. Through this lens, the earlier uncertainties begin to settle into a more defined picture. The scattered teeth, once part of a living system, now form a record that aligns with the anatomical signals preserved in bone. Together, they suggest an animal whose connection to water was not occasional, but continuous, expressed not only in structure, but in the quiet accumulation of evidence left behind over time. Hunting leaves few direct traces, yet it shapes the body more precisely than almost any other behavior. In the case of Spinosaurus, the clues lie not in a single feature, but in a coordinated set of structures, each aligned with a method that unfolds close to the surface of moving water. The skull extends forward in a long, narrow form, comparable to that of a modern gharial, a crocodilian known for its specialization in catching fish. This shape reduces resistance when moving through water and allows the jaws to close quickly with minimal disturbance. Rather than a deep, crushing bite, the design favors speed and precision, qualities that matter when prey can vanish in an instant. Along the jaws, the teeth differ from those of most large theropods. They are conical and smooth, arranged to interlock when the mouth closes. Such teeth are not suited for slicing through flesh or breaking bone. Instead, they act as gripping tools, holding onto prey that is both fast and difficult to secure. Once caught, the prey is prevented from slipping free, even as it struggles within the current. Subtle features on the snout add another layer to this system. Small pits along the surface suggest the presence of pressure-sensitive receptors, similar to those found in modern crocodilians. These receptors can detect minute changes in water movement, allowing an animal to sense the approach or motion of prey without relying on sight. In water that may be clouded with sediment or disturbed by current, this sensitivity becomes a reliable guide. Within this environment, one of the primary prey species was Onchopristis, a large ray-like fish that moved through the river with its own form of precision. Its most striking feature was an extended rostrum lined with hardened, barbed denticles, each capable of inflicting injury. Some individuals reached lengths of 8 to 9 meters, their bodies occupying a significant portion of the water column. This was not passive prey, but an animal equipped to resist capture. Evidence of this interaction appears in fossil remains where marks left by Spinosaurus teeth are preserved on bones associated with Onchopristis. These marks provide a direct link between predator and prey, recording moments of contact that once occurred within the river. They confirm not only the diet, but the physical engagement between the two. The method of capture likely unfolded in shallow water, where visibility and maneuverability aligned. The animal would position itself with part of its body submerged, using its sensory systems to detect movement below the surface. When prey came within range, the strike would follow quickly, the jaws closing in a forward motion that minimized resistance. The elongated snout allowed reach without requiring the entire body to move at once, conserving energy while maintaining precision. This approach resembles the feeding behavior seen in certain modern animals that rely on stillness followed by rapid motion. A heron standing at the edge of a stream, or a bear positioned along a narrow channel, both depend on timing and alignment rather than prolonged pursuit. In Spinosaurus, the same principle appears adapted to a larger scale, supported by anatomical features that enhance detection and capture within water. Despite its size, the animal's role within the ecosystem diverges from that of other large predators sharing the same region. Its primary food source lay beneath the surface, separating its activity from those that hunted on land. This division reduced direct competition, allowing multiple large carnivores to exist within the same broader environment while drawing from different resources. The result is a hunting strategy defined by water, shaped by movement that is both measured and precise, and recorded in the physical traces left behind within the fossil record. Above the spine of this animal rises a structure that does not settle easily into a single explanation. It begins as a series of elongated neural spines extending upward from each vertebra, forming a continuous ridge that reaches a height of roughly 1.65 meters at its tallest point. In life, these spines would have supported soft tissue, creating a broad surface that stood clear against the surrounding landscape. This feature draws attention not only because of its size, but because of its uncertainty. Unlike the jaws or the tail, which align closely with observable function, the sail resists a single definitive role. Over time, several interpretations have emerged, each grounded in comparison with living systems, yet none fully resolving the question on its own. One possibility considers the movement of heat. A structure of this scale, filled with blood vessels and covered in skin, could exchange thermal energy with the surrounding environment. When exposed to sunlight, it might absorb warmth, raising the body temperature of the animal more efficiently than its bulk alone would allow. When conditions shifted, that same surface could release excess heat into the air. For an animal moving between water and open air, this capacity for regulation would provide a steady advantage, smoothing the transitions between different thermal environments. Another interpretation turns toward energy storage. In some large mammals, elevated structures along the back hold dense reserves of fat used during periods when food becomes scarce. Applied to Spinosaurus, this model suggests that the sail may have supported a similar deposit, forming a kind of elongated hump. Within a seasonal system, where water levels and resource availability changed over time, stored energy could bridge the intervals between abundance and scarcity, allowing the animal to maintain its condition when conditions shifted. A third perspective focuses on visibility rather than internal function. When partially submerged, much of the body would remain hidden beneath the surface, leaving only the upper portion exposed. In such a position, the sail would rise above the waterline, forming a clear and continuous outline. This visibility could serve as a signal, allowing individuals to recognize one another across distance or to establish presence within shared space. Its size and shape might also influence how other large animals approached the water, acting as a form of silent communication without direct interaction. Each of these interpretations aligns with certain aspects of the structure, yet none excludes the others. The same surface that exchanges heat can also remain visible, and the internal space that supports tissue can accommodate different types of material. Current understanding tends to favor a combination where the sail participates in both thermoregulation and display, its full function emerging from the interaction of these roles rather than from a single purpose. Regardless of its exact role, the structure would have made the animal immediately recognizable. Against the open background of the floodplain, or rising above the surface of still water, it would form a distinct silhouette, one that could be seen from considerable distance. In an environment shared with other large predators, such visibility carries implications for movement, spacing, and interaction. The sail therefore stands as both a physical feature and a point of ongoing inquiry, a reminder that even with substantial evidence, certain aspects of ancient life remain open to interpretation. It anchors the image of the animal in a way that is unmistakable, while continuing to invite careful consideration of the processes that shaped it. Beyond the water's edge, where the ground holds firm and movement follows a different rhythm, another form takes shape within the same landscape. It does not carry the same adaptations for immersion or balance in shifting currents. Instead, its structure reflects contact with solid ground, where weight, stride, and impact define the limits of motion. This animal is known as Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, a name that translates to shark-toothed lizard, drawn from the form of its teeth. Along its jaws, the teeth are long, flattened, and edged with fine serrations, closely resembling those of a large predatory shark. Each tooth functions less as a gripping tool and more as a blade designed to slice through flesh with efficiency. The arrangement suggests a feeding strategy built around cutting and tearing rather than holding. In size, it stands among the largest predators to have lived on land. Estimates place its length between 12 and 13 meters, with a body mass that reflects both strength and mobility. Its proportions differ from those of Spinosaurus in almost every respect. The hind limbs are long and well developed, supporting a posture that allows for sustained movement across open ground. The torso is balanced, and the tail extends as a counterweight, stabilizing the body during motion. The history of its discovery carries its own interruptions. The original specimen, described in the early 20th century, was housed in a museum in Munich. During the bombing of the city in the Second World War, that specimen was destroyed, leaving behind only records and illustrations. For decades, the animal existed primarily through those descriptions, its physical form inaccessible to direct study. In 1995, new material was brought forward by the paleontologist Paul Sereno, allowing the structure of the animal to be examined again in detail and restoring its place within the broader understanding of the ecosystem. Everything about its anatomy aligns with life on land. The skull is deep and robust, capable of generating significant bite force. The limbs support forward motion over distance, and the overall build suggests an animal capable of both speed and sustained pursuit. Unlike Spinosaurus, which carries features that draw it toward water, Carcharodontosaurus remains fully terrestrial in both form and function. Within the same deposits, the remains of large herbivorous dinosaurs appear, including Rebecchisaurus, a long-necked animal that moved through the landscape with considerable mass. Such prey would require a predator capable of delivering powerful, controlled bites, removing sections of flesh rather than relying on restraint alone. The teeth and jaw structure of Carcharodontosaurus align with this requirement, indicating a role focused on large terrestrial prey. The presence of both Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus within the same region might suggest competition at first glance, yet their differences reduce direct overlap. One draws energy from within the water, interacting with prey that moves through a fluid environment. The other operates across land, engaging with animals that follow entirely different patterns of movement and behavior. Their bodies reflect these distinctions so clearly that they occupy separate ecological spaces despite sharing the same broader landscape. This separation allows each to reach a substantial size without forcing constant conflict. Resources are partitioned not by distance alone, but by medium, by the difference between water and land. In this way, the system accommodates more than one large predator, each aligned with a specific part of the environment. Carcharodontosaurus stands as the counterpart to Spinosaurus, not as a rival within the same domain, but as a parallel presence shaped by a different set of conditions. Its form carries the imprint of open ground, where motion and force define the act of hunting, and where the absence of water changes the rules that govern survival. Not every predator in this landscape relied on mass or force. Some were shaped instead by distance, by the ability to close space quickly before an opportunity could vanish. Within the same environment that held heavier forms, another hunter moved with a different set of priorities, its body arranged for speed rather than impact. This animal is known as Deltadromeus agilis, a name that translates to agile river runner. It reached an estimated length of around 8 meters, placing it below the largest predators of its time, yet its proportions set it apart in a more subtle way. Where others carried weight through thick bone and muscle, this form appears more lightly built, its structure leaning toward efficiency of motion. The limbs are long and slender, extending the stride and allowing greater coverage of ground with each step. The bones suggest reduced mass relative to length, a configuration that supports rapid acceleration and sustained running. In theropods of this scale, such proportions are unusual, indicating a specialization that differs from the more common ambush or power-based strategies. Its exact place within dinosaur classification remains uncertain. Some researchers have proposed that it belongs outside the group it was first assigned to, suggesting affinities with entirely different lineages. The available material leaves room for interpretation, and without more complete specimens, its relationships remain open to revision. Even so, the physical traits preserved in the fossils provide a clear indication of its functional role within the ecosystem. Rather than engaging with the largest prey, this predator likely focused on animals of intermediate size, those that moved along the margins between open ground and water. Such prey would require pursuit rather than confrontation, favoring a hunter that could match or exceed their speed over short distances. The terrain near the river, with its alternating patches of firm ground and softer sediment, would create spaces where rapid movement offered a decisive advantage. In this context, the body of Deltadromeus aligns with a strategy centered on pursuit. The extended limbs allow it to maintain velocity across uneven surfaces, while its lighter frame reduces the energy cost of movement. Instead of waiting in concealment, it could track and follow, adjusting its path as prey attempted to escape. The capture would depend less on a single powerful strike and more on the ability to remain close until an opening appeared. Comparisons to modern animals suggest a parallel with predators that rely on speed across open terrain. A cheetah, for example, uses acceleration and agility to close the distance between itself and its target, ending the chase quickly before exhaustion sets in. While the environment and scale differ, the underlying principle remains similar. Deltadromeus appears to occupy a comparable role, adapted to exploit movement rather than resistance. The presence of this third large predator adds another layer to the structure of the ecosystem. Each of the major carnivores displays a distinct set of physical traits, aligning with different methods of hunting and different types of prey. One draws from water, another from large land-dwelling animals, and this one from those that move quickly along the transitional zones. Their coexistence reflects a division of roles that reduces direct overlap, allowing each to persist within the same broader region. Through this distribution, the system accommodates multiple large hunters without forcing them into constant conflict. The differences in body form are not incidental. They are the result of adaptation to specific conditions within a shared environment. Deltadromeus represents the expression of speed within that arrangement, a form shaped by the need to move swiftly across the edges of a landscape defined by both land and water. Some traces remain incomplete, their outlines suggested, but never fully resolved. Among the remains recovered from this formation, there are fragments that point to another large predator, one that does not yet carry a stable identity. The bones are partial, scattered, and insufficient to anchor a precise classification, yet they belong to a group known for distinctive features, a lineage of carnivorous dinosaurs called Abelisaurids. Members of this family are recognized by their compact, deep skulls and reduced forelimbs, structures that differ sharply from other theropods. Their bodies often emphasize strength at the head and neck, suggesting feeding strategies built around powerful bites delivered at close range. The fragmentary material from the Kem Kem indicates the presence of such an animal, though without enough detail to assign it to a named genus. It remains one of the quieter uncertainties within the system, acknowledged through absence as much as through evidence. This fourth predator adds to a growing pattern, one that extends beyond land alone. Above the river, large pterosaurs moved through the air, their wingspans reaching up to 6 meters. They were not dinosaurs, but a separate lineage of flying reptiles, adapted for movement across open space. Their long jaws and slender teeth suggest a diet focused on fish taken from the surface or just below it. From above, they interacted with the same resource that sustained life within the water, approaching it from a different direction. Within the shallows, another presence emerges, shaped by ancestry linked to crocodilians, yet distinct from modern forms. These crocodiliforms reached considerable size, their bodies adapted for movement through water and across its margins. They occupied positions that overlapped with those of Spinosaurus, drawing from similar prey while operating with different proportions and methods. Their existence adds another layer to the concentration of large predators associated with the river. Taken together, these elements form a complex arrangement. Multiple large carnivores, each with significant energetic demands, appear within the same general environment. At first glance, such density might suggest instability, a system unable to sustain itself without collapse. Yet the evidence indicates persistence, a balance maintained over extended periods. The structure of that balance lies in division rather than overlap. Each predator aligns with a specific set of conditions, defined by the type of prey it targets, the method it uses to capture it, and the part of the environment it occupies most consistently. The differences in anatomy observed across these species are not incidental. They reflect distinct roles within a shared landscape. Some draw their energy from within the water, interacting directly with aquatic prey. Others operate along the margins, where movement across open ground allows pursuit. Still others engage from above, descending toward the surface with precision. Even within the shallows, variations in size and behavior reduce direct competition. These distinctions form a pattern of niche partitioning, where the available resources are divided across multiple strategies rather than concentrated into a single pathway. The river itself acts as the central organizing element within this system. It gathers energy in one place, creating a corridor that attracts predators from different directions. At the same time, it separates them through structure, offering distinct zones that can be used in different ways. Water depth, current, and surrounding terrain combine to create boundaries that are not fixed but are sufficient to guide behavior. Through this arrangement, coexistence becomes possible without constant conflict. The system does not rely on a single dominant predator, excluding all others. Instead, it supports multiple large hunters, each shaped by a particular relationship with the same underlying resource. This complexity leads back to the foundation that supports it, a source of energy that moves through the river in a form both abundant and substantial, sustaining every layer built above it. Beneath the surface, where light fades into suspended particles and movement becomes a matter of pressure and vibration, the foundation of this world takes shape. It is not immediately visible from above, yet it determines the scale and structure of everything that depends on it. Within these waters, life gathered in forms that extended beyond familiar limits, filling the river with bodies that altered its rhythm simply by existing within it. Among the most distinctive was Onchopristis numitus, a large saw-bearing fish whose presence defined much of the interaction below the surface. Its elongated rostrum projected forward, edged with a series of hardened denticles that curved slightly backward, each one capable of catching and holding. This structure functioned as both sensor and instrument, allowing the animal to detect and engage with its surroundings in a single motion. Individuals reached lengths approaching 9 meters, their movement creating shifts in water that would register across considerable distance. Moving through deeper channels were coelacanths, represented here by forms such as Axolrhodicthus, though related to species that still exist in reduced form today. These individuals occupied a different scale, their bodies larger and more substantial. Their fins moved in a steady, coordinated pattern, allowing them to navigate slower waters with controlled motion. They carried a lineage that stretched far back in time, yet within this environment, they were not remnants, but active participants in a system defined by abundance. In other parts of the river, Boëtius appeared, a fish resembling modern bichurs but expanded far beyond their current size. Its elongated body and reinforced scales allowed it to move through both open water and more confined spaces near the bottom. The structure of its fins suggests a capacity to adjust position precisely, maintaining stability even as conditions shifted around it. It occupied a niche that bridged different parts of the river, connecting zones that varied in depth and flow. Lungfish added another layer to this system, their biology allowing them to endure changes that would challenge other species. During periods when water levels dropped, they could retreat into the sediment, forming a protective layer around themselves and entering a state of reduced activity. This ability ensured their persistence across seasonal transitions, maintaining their presence even when conditions became less stable. Together, these species formed a population of considerable mass, one that extended across the full range of the river's structure. Their combined presence created a continuous source of energy, moving through the system in a form accessible to larger predators. The size of individual fish increased the efficiency of each interaction, allowing a single successful hunt to provide substantial return. The cycle that sustained this abundance followed the movement of seasonal rainfall. When water levels rose, the river expanded outward, connecting channels and dispersing organisms across a wider area. As the water receded, those same organisms became concentrated within narrower spaces, increasing their density and making them more accessible. This pattern repeated over time, creating intervals where food became temporarily abundant in predictable locations. Such regularity allowed predators to align their behavior with the shifting distribution of prey. The river did not offer a constant state, but it provided a rhythm that could be followed. Within that rhythm, the large fish remained the central resource, supporting a network of interactions that extended across different environments. The scale of this aquatic population shaped the entire ecosystem. Without it, the number and size of predators would not have been sustainable. It formed the base upon which every other layer depended, a quiet but decisive force that determined what could exist above it and how those forms would interact over time. Some discoveries do not remain where they are found. They travel, carried from the place that shaped them into rooms designed to preserve and study what time has left behind. In the early 20th century, fragments of an unfamiliar predator were lifted from rock in Egypt and taken across continents, entering a collection where they would begin a second life, one defined by careful observation and record. In 1912, Ernst Stromer documented the remains that would later be recognized as Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. The material was incomplete, yet it held enough detail to suggest a form unlike other known theropods. Over several years, Stromer described the bones in measured detail, producing drawings and notes that attempted to capture their structure. These records became the primary way the animal was understood, translating physical fragments into a representation that could be shared and studied. The bones themselves were housed in the Bayerische Staatssammlung for Paleontology in Munich, a museum dedicated to the study of ancient life. Within its collections, the Spinosaurus remains occupied a specific place, one that allowed researchers to return to them, to compare, to refine interpretations as new material from other species emerged. Their presence anchored the species in something tangible, a reference that could be examined directly. On the night of April 24, 1944, that continuity was broken. During a period of sustained aerial bombing, the city of Munich was struck repeatedly. The museum was among the buildings hit, and within it, Stromer's collection was caught in the resulting destruction. Fire moved through the structure, consuming what had been preserved within it. By the time the damage settled, the original Spinosaurus specimen, along with many other fossils, had been lost. What remained were the records Stromer had created decades earlier. His drawings and descriptions became the only means through which the animal could be studied. Without the physical bones, certain details could no longer be verified, and subtle features that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted could not be revisited. The species continued to exist within scientific literature, but its foundation had shifted from direct observation to documentation. For a long period, this limitation shaped every discussion of Spinosaurus. Comparisons with newly discovered species relied on reconstructions derived from Stromer's work, introducing a layer of uncertainty that could not be resolved. The absence of the original material created a gap that remained open, influencing how the animal was placed within broader evolutionary frameworks. In 1995, a partial return occurred through an unexpected source. Stromer's son donated his father's personal archives to the same institution, providing access to photographs taken during the original study. These images offered a different perspective from the published drawings, capturing details that had not been fully conveyed in illustration. By comparing the photographs with the existing descriptions, researchers were able to identify small discrepancies, refining their understanding of the original specimen. Even with this addition, the loss remained significant. Photographs and notes can preserve information, but they cannot replace the complexity of the original material. The absence of the bones themselves limits the range of questions that can be asked, leaving certain aspects of the animal's structure unresolved. Within the broader history of paleontology, this event stands as a reminder of how knowledge can be altered not only by discovery, but by loss. The destruction of the Spinosaurus holotype removed a direct link to the past, leaving behind a record that is both valuable and incomplete. For a long stretch of time, The image of this animal remained stable, shaped less by evidence than by absence. Without complete material to examine, it was placed within a familiar outline, imagined as a large bipedal predator, upright, balanced on strong hind limbs, its sail rising from a body otherwise consistent with other theropods. This reconstruction held not because it was certain, but because it fit within known patterns. That stability shifted in 2014 when the paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim and his colleagues assembled a partial skeleton from material collected in the Kem Kem beds. The reconstruction did not simply add detail to an existing model, it altered the foundation of that model in ways that could not be easily reconciled with previous assumptions. One of the most striking differences appeared in the hind limbs. Rather than the long, powerful legs expected of a terrestrial predator, the limbs were proportionally shorter. Their length did not align with efficient bipedal locomotion, suggesting that movement across land would have been slower and less stable than previously imagined. This single change began to shift the center of the animal's behavior away from open ground. The tail introduced an even more unexpected feature. Instead of a rigid structure used primarily for balance, it extended into a form shaped by elongated spines that supported a broad, flexible surface. The proportions and articulation suggested movement through water, with the tail functioning as a propulsive organ rather than a static counterweight. No other known theropod displayed a comparable structure, making this adaptation difficult to place within existing categories. Taken together, these features pointed toward a different interpretation of the animal's lifestyle. In their study, published in the journal Science, Ibrahim and his team proposed that Spinosaurus represented a semi-aquatic dinosaur, one that spent a significant portion of its time within water rather than on land. This idea marked a departure from previous views, introducing a model in which the animal's anatomy aligned with behaviors not commonly associated with large theropods. The proposal did not settle immediately into consensus. Some researchers questioned whether the specimen represented a juvenile individual whose proportions might change with growth. Others raised the possibility that the bones used in the reconstruction came from more than one animal, creating a composite that did not reflect a single organism. These interpretations reflected the caution that accompanies major revisions, particularly when they challenge long-held assumptions. Further work followed, building on the initial findings. In 2020, additional analysis used computed tomography to examine the internal structure of the bones. The results revealed a level of density consistent with adaptation to life in water, reinforcing the interpretation that the observed features were not temporary or developmental, but functional. The evidence supported the idea that these traits were part of a coordinated system shaped by sustained interaction with an aquatic environment. With these developments, the understanding of Spinosaurus divided into two distinct phases. Earlier interpretations, based on limited material, placed it within a familiar framework. Later discoveries introduced a set of features that required a different approach, one that moved beyond those initial constraints. The transition between these phases did not occur gradually, but through the accumulation of evidence that shifted the balance toward a new model. This change illustrates how the interpretation of a species can evolve as new material becomes available. The animal itself did not alter, but the way it is understood continues to adjust, shaped by each addition to the record. Not every scientific path begins with a planned expedition. Some begin in places shaped by trade rather than research, where fragments of the past appear without clear origin, separated from the layers that once held them. In such settings, knowledge moves differently, guided by chance encounters and the slow recognition of patterns that only become clear over time. In 2008, Nazar Ibrahim encountered a set of fossil bones at a market in Morocco. They were not presented as part of a documented site, but as individual objects, already removed from their original context. He acquired them and brought them back for study, noting their unusual characteristics, but without a complete understanding of their significance. At that stage, they existed as isolated pieces, disconnected from the broader structure that would later give them meaning. Years passed before a connection emerged. Additional material arrived at a museum in Milan, carrying features that aligned closely with the bones Ibrahim had obtained earlier. The texture of the surrounding rock, its composition and color, matched in a way that suggested a shared origin. This recognition did not come from a single observation, but from the accumulation of small consistencies, each one reinforcing the possibility that these fragments belong to the same source. From that point, the focus shifted from analysis to search. The key to understanding the bones lay not only in their structure, but in the location from which they had been removed. Without that information, their full context remained incomplete. Ibrahim began to trace the path back through the chain of exchange, seeking the individual who had first brought the material to market. This effort extended over several years, involving repeated attempts to identify and locate a single fossil dealer within a large and active network. Eventually, the search led to Casablanca, where the dealer was found. From there, the connection to the original site was restored. Guided by this individual, Ibrahim and his colleagues traveled to the location in the Kem Kem beds where the bones had been excavated. The site itself provided what the isolated specimens could not, a setting that revealed how the bones were positioned within the rock, how they related to surrounding material, and how they fit within the broader geological framework. This process highlights a persistent challenge within paleontology. Fossils that are collected for commercial purposes often lose the context that gives them scientific value. Once removed from their original position, details about their precise location, orientation, and association with other remains can be lost. Without that information, interpretation becomes more limited and certain conclusions remain uncertain. The Kem Kem region has been subject to extensive commercial excavation for decades. Local collectors have worked the area continuously, uncovering large quantities of material that enter private collections or are sold through markets. While this activity brings specimens into circulation, it also separates many of them from the data that would allow a complete understanding of their origin. As a result, an unknown number of significant fossils exist beyond the reach of formal study, their scientific potential reduced by the absence of context. At the same time, the collaboration between local collectors and researchers remains complex. Knowledge of the terrain, developed over generations, allows access to sites that might otherwise remain undiscovered. The challenge lies in preserving both the material and the information that accompanies it, ensuring that each find contributes fully to the reconstruction of the past. The path that led to the reconstruction of Spinosaurus reflects this balance between loss and recovery. It shows how fragments can be reconnected through persistence and how the absence of context can be partially restored through careful work. At the edge of the desert, the ground rises into a long, uneven wall of stone, its surface marked by layers that record changes far older than the landscape surrounding it. This escarpment stretches across the boundary between Morocco and Algeria, exposing a sequence of sediments that would otherwise remain buried. Each band carries its own composition and texture, a quiet archive arranged vertically rather than across distance. Within this structure, The fossil-bearing layer rests beneath a cap of limestone, a boundary that separates two different conditions in time. The limestone formed when rising seas moved inland, covering the low-lying terrain that had once supported the river system. This shift occurred roughly 93 to 94 million years ago, leaving behind a distinct layer that now sits above the earlier deposits. It marks the end of one environment and the beginning of another, a transition preserved not as a gradual blend, but as a clear division within the rock. Below this cap, the sediments that hold the remains of the river ecosystem appear in varying states of exposure. In some places, erosion has cut into the cliff face, revealing sections where fossils can be found near the surface. In others, the same layer remains hidden beneath overlying material, its contents inaccessible without further removal of rock. The result is a landscape where visibility changes from one location to another, creating a patchwork of access across the formation. The escarpment itself represents only a portion of the full extent of these deposits. Beyond the exposed edge, similar layers continue beneath the broader expanse of the Sahara, covered by sand and younger sediments. Their distribution extends across a region far larger than what can be directly observed, suggesting that the known sites are fragments of a much wider system. What lies beneath remains largely unexamined, not because it lacks significance, but because it is difficult to reach. Erosion plays a continuous role in revealing new material. Wind and occasional rainfall remove surface layers, gradually exposing sections that were previously hidden. Each season alters the face of the cliff in small ways, uncovering fragments that were not visible before. Local fossil hunters move across these areas with familiarity, often encountering specimens as they emerge from the rock. Their observations contribute to the ongoing discovery of material, though the speed of exposure means that some finds appear before they can be documented in detail. Over the past several decades, this formation has yielded a series of discoveries that have reshaped understanding of the Cretaceous in North Africa. Each new specimen adds to the picture, providing additional points of reference that refine existing interpretations. At the same time, the incomplete nature of the exposure suggests that many elements of the ecosystem remain unrecorded, still held within layers that have yet to be uncovered. The scale of what remains unseen introduces a different perspective on the record that is already available. The fossils that have been studied represent only a fraction of the total material that exists within the region. Their distribution reflects both the processes of deposition that place them there and the processes of erosion that have revealed them. In this way, the escarpment functions as both archive and threshold, offering access to a past environment while also indicating the extent of what remains beyond reach. The visible layers provide a structured record, yet they also point toward a larger continuity that extends beneath the surface, waiting for the gradual processes of exposure to bring it into view. Time in this landscape did not pass evenly. It moved in pulses, expanding and contracting through the year, shaping conditions that shifted between abundance and restraint. These changes are recorded not only in the arrangement of sediment, but within the chemistry of the fossils themselves. Ratios of oxygen isotopes preserved in bone and tooth reflect the temperature and composition of the water an animal lived in, and within those values, a pattern emerges, one defined by strong seasonality rather than constant stability. Rain did not fall evenly across the year. Instead, moisture arrived in concentrated periods, driven inland by monsoon systems that carried large volumes of water over short spans of time. When these rains came, the river expanded beyond its usual boundaries. Channels connected, floodplains filled, and areas that had been separate became part of a continuous system. Nutrients moved freely through the water, stirred from sediment, and redistributed across a wider space. This expansion triggered a rapid response among aquatic life. Fish populations increased, both through growth and reproduction, as conditions allowed for wide dispersal and access to new habitats. Breeding events occurred on a large scale, filling the water with new individuals that would grow within the temporary extension of the system. For a period, the river held more life than at any other point in its cycle, creating a phase where food was widely available. As the monsoon passed, the system shifted again. Without sustained rainfall, water levels began to fall. Channels that had once been connected, separated, and the broad surface of the floodplain contracted into narrower pathways. Pools formed where water remained trapped, their boundaries defined by the uneven terrain. Within these spaces, fish that had dispersed during the wet season became concentrated, their numbers compressed into smaller volumes. This concentration changed the dynamics of predation. Prey became easier to locate and capture, yet the same conditions drew multiple predators into the same areas. Competition increased, not through expansion but through limitation. The abundance of the wet season gave way to a more focused distribution, where access to food depended on timing and position within the shrinking system. Some species adapted to these changes in ways that allowed them to persist through the most restrictive phases. Lungfish, for example, could retreat into the sediment as water receded, surrounding themselves with a protective layer and entering a state of reduced activity known as aestivation. In this condition, metabolic processes slowed, allowing the animal to survive until water returned. This strategy allowed them to remain within the system even when surface conditions became less favorable. For large predators, movement became the primary response. Rather than remaining in a single location, they likely followed the retreating water, tracking the channels as they narrowed and shifted. This behavior required an ability to move across different parts of the landscape, transitioning between deeper water and exposed ground as conditions changed. In this way, survival depended not only on strength or size, but on flexibility, the capacity to adjust to a system that did not remain constant. The cycle of expansion and contraction governed the flow of energy through the ecosystem. During the wet phase, resources spread outward, supporting growth and reproduction across multiple levels. During the dry phase, those same resources became concentrated, sustaining predators through a more limited but accessible supply. The rhythm did not eliminate scarcity, but it balanced it with periods of abundance, creating a system that persisted through variation rather than uniformity. Within this pattern, certain traits provided clear advantages. The ability to operate in both aquatic and adjacent environments allowed some species to remain effective across changing conditions. For Spinosaurus, this flexibility may have been particularly important, aligning its behavior with the shifting distribution of water and prey. Predation is often imagined as a one-sided exchange, yet within this system the boundary between hunter and hunted carries a different weight. The animals that moved through the water were not simply resources waiting to be taken. They carried their own structures for resistance, shaped by the same pressures that refined the predators that pursued them. Among these, Onchopristis stands out not only for its size, but for the design of its forward extension. The rostrum projects outward as a rigid blade, edged with rows of denticles that curve slightly back toward the body. Each of these structures is hardened and anchored, capable of catching, cutting, or deflecting. When moved through the water, this extension becomes an active element, not passive decoration, sweeping or striking with force when the animal reacts. The interaction between this fish and its primary predator unfolds within a narrow space where movement must be precise. A strike from above or alongside meets not only flesh but structure, and in that moment the prey carries the capacity to respond. The denticles along the rostrum can make contact with skin and bone, leaving marks that persist long after the encounter has ended. Evidence of these encounters appears in the fossil record as healed injuries preserved within the bones of Spinosaurus. Some specimens show damage consistent with contact from a rigid, edged structure, followed by signs of recovery. The presence of healing indicates that these were not fatal events, but they record moments where the predator itself was struck during the act of hunting. The bone carries the trace of impact, then the slower process of repair, a sequence that reflects both vulnerability and survival. This exchange forms a pattern that extends beyond individual encounters. Over time, predator and prey influence one another through repeated interaction. Structures that increase efficiency in capture are met by structures that increase the ability to resist. The result is not a fixed advantage but a shifting balance, where each adaptation introduces new pressures on the other. Within the same environment, other animals contributed to this complexity. Large crocodiliforms occupied parts of the river where depth and cover allowed them to remain partially concealed. Some individuals reached lengths of 6 to 7 meters, their bodies capable of rapid movement over short distances. Their presence added another layer to the interactions within the shallows, particularly for individuals that were smaller or less capable of sustained resistance. In such conditions, size alone did not guarantee safety. A juvenile Spinosaurus, or one weakened by previous injury, would move through a landscape where multiple threats existed simultaneously. The river offered both opportunity and risk, its resources balanced by the presence of other large organisms competing for access. The structure of this system reveals that even the most specialized predator operated within limits, its anatomy aligned with a particular mode of hunting, yet that alignment did not remove the possibility of harm. Each encounter carried a degree of uncertainty, shaped by the movement of water, the position of prey, and the presence of other animals within the same space. Through these interactions, the river becomes more than a source of energy. It acts as a field where forces meet, where survival depends on the ability to engage, to adapt, and to recover. The marks preserved in bone are not only records of feeding, but of resistance, moments where the expected direction of control briefly shifted before settling again into the broader pattern of the ecosystem. At the edge, where firm ground softens into water, two very different bodies of power come into proximity without ever fully merging. The river does not form a hard boundary, yet it shapes behavior as clearly as any wall. Along this shifting margin, one animal slows as the substrate loosens beneath its feet, while another finds increasing stability with each step into the shallows. No preserved bone carries a clear signature of conflict between these two species. There are no punctures or fractures that can be confidently assigned from one to the other, no direct record of collision. Yet their presence, within the same formation, within the same narrow corridor of life, suggests that their paths approached one another repeatedly across time. Carcharodontosaurus moved across the open ground beyond the water's reach, its body built for forward motion and force delivered through the head. The skull is deep and reinforced, the teeth laterally compressed and edged, designed to slice rather than hold. Its limbs support a gait suited to distance, allowing it to cover territory that extended far beyond the immediate influence of the river. Still, water draws all large animals inward, and at certain moments the land-based predator would have approached the bank, lowering its head to drink or to investigate movement at the margin. There, the presence of another apex form would have been apparent. Spinosaurus occupied the shallow channels with a different balance, its center of mass distributed for partial submersion, its propulsion shifting from limb to tail as depth increased. Where the ground predator relies on footing and leverage, this animal draws advantage from resistance in the water itself. The same length that reduces stability on land becomes an asset once buoyancy begins to offset weight. The difference in construction defines the nature of any potential encounter. On exposed ground, the shorter hind limbs of Spinosaurus would limit speed and maneuverability. Its posture would not allow the same rapid turns or sustained pursuit that characterize a terrestrial hunter. In such a setting, the heavier skull and greater bite force of Carcharodontosaurus would become decisive. Each movement, supported by a structure evolved for impact delivered against resisting prey. Closer to the water, the balance shifts. As the surface deepens, the tail of Spinosaurus contributes increasing thrust, allowing controlled movement where footing becomes uncertain for the other. The ability to remain partially supported by the surrounding medium reduces the constraints imposed by mass. In this space, the long snout can be directed with precision, and the body can pivot without the same dependence on ground friction. These opposing advantages create a situation where neither animal holds dominance across all conditions. The environment itself determines which traits can be expressed fully at any given moment. Because of this, the most stable outcome is not confrontation but separation. Each species occupies the region where its structure provides the greatest efficiency, minimizing the need to engage with a competitor that excels under different circumstances. The river thus functions as a mediator, not by preventing contact entirely, but by distributing opportunity in a way that reduces overlap. Encounters may have occurred at the boundary, brief alignments where both forms were present within the same frame, yet the absence of direct evidence suggests that these moments rarely escalated into sustained conflict. Instead, coexistence emerges through avoidance, guided by the physical limits of each body and the gradients of the landscape. The margin between land and water remains a place of proximity, where two dominant predators pass near one another without merging their paths, each returning to the domain where its design remains most complete. High above the shifting channels, where warm currents rise from sunlit water, another layer of motion unfolds without touching the ground. The air itself becomes a pathway, carrying bodies that never need to rest upon the sediment below. Within this open space, wings stretch wide, thin membranes held taut between elongated fingers, each movement measured and efficient as they ride invisible gradients. These are pterosaurs, not members of the dinosaur lineage, but a separate branch of reptiles that achieved powered flight through their own evolutionary path. In this region, forms such as Anhanguera and its close relatives drift across the sky, their wings spanning between 4 and 6 meters, broad enough to sustain long glides with minimal effort. Their skulls extend forward into narrow profiles, often crowned with crests that catch the light, while their jaws carry rows of slender teeth suited for a precise kind of capture. From this height, the river below is not a boundary, but a continuous ribbon of activity. The surface shifts with constant disturbance, subtle ripples spreading outward where bodies pass just beneath. For an animal scanning from above, these disturbances become signals, brief distortions that reveal movement otherwise hidden from view. With a controlled descent, the pterosaur lowers itself toward the water, wings angling to reduce speed, head aligning with the surface in a moment of near stillness before contact. The method is direct and refined, A quick closure of the jaws, a brief resistance from the water, and then ascent, the captured fish held securely between interlocking teeth. This interaction happens in fragments of time, repeated again and again as the animal moves along the length of the channel. Each successful strike leaves little trace behind, only a widening circle on the surface that fades almost as soon as it forms. Below, another hunter operates within the same corridor, guided not by sight from above, but by signals carried through the water itself. The targets overlap, the timing often converging, yet the approaches remain distinct. One descends from air to water, the other rises from water toward the surface. Their senses interpret the same environment through different mediums, allowing both to function within the same space without direct interference. Fossil remains of these aerial forms appear throughout the exposed layers, scattered among the bones of aquatic and terrestrial species. Their presence is not occasional but persistent, indicating a population that moved regularly through this system. The diversity suggests variation in size, shape, and behavior, each form adapting to slightly different conditions within the same overarching habitat. From above, the entire system resolves into a pattern of layered movement. The water carries its own flow of life, dense with motion beneath a reflective surface. Along the margins, large bodies traverse the firmer ground, their paths tracing the edges where vegetation and open space meet. Overhead, wings describe slow arcs, linking distant stretches of the river into a single continuous domain. This arrangement creates a structure that extends vertically as much as it does horizontally. Predation is not confined to one level but distributed across air, land, and water, each layer interacting with the others through shared resources. The river becomes a central axis around which all movement organizes, a corridor that supports life in multiple dimensions at once. Within this layered system, prey must navigate pressures arriving from directions that cannot always be anticipated. Movement at the surface carries risk from above and below, while the banks present their own set of dangers. The scarcity of certain remains within the fossil record hints at an imbalance, a question that lingers quietly within the sediment, shaping the understanding of how such a system could persist. Between the layered movements of hunters, quieter forms persist, their presence less obvious yet no less essential. They leave fewer traces, not because they were absent, but because the conditions that favored preservation did not favor them in equal measure. Their lives unfolded in the same space, shaped by the same river, yet their story must be assembled from fragments that appear only occasionally within the stone. Among the largest of these was Prehistoric garazbe, a long-necked herbivore whose body extended to nearly 20 meters in length. Its frame was built for steady feeding rather than speed, a slow progression through vegetation that grew along the margins of the water system. The neck allowed it to reach across a wide area without moving its massive body, gathering plant matter that flourished where moisture remained consistent. In a landscape defined by seasonal shifts, such access would have been essential. Yet its remains are uncommon. Compared to the abundance of carnivorous species recorded in the same formation, the bones of large plant eaters appear only in scattered intervals. This imbalance carries meaning. It suggests either that these animals were fewer in number, or that their bodies were rarely left intact long enough to enter the fossil record. In an environment dense with scavengers and predators, even a large carcass would have been rapidly broken down, each component dispersed before burial could occur. Smaller forms leave a clearer signature. Turtles, protected by durable shells, are found throughout the deposits, their remains persisting where more fragile structures did not. Their presence indicates a steady baseline of life, tied closely to the water, animals that fed within the system rather than ranging far from it. Their survival strategy relied not on speed or size, but on protection and adaptability, allowing them to persist through both abundance and scarcity. This pattern reveals something fundamental about how energy moved through the ecosystem. Instead of relying primarily on large terrestrial herbivores to support predators, the system appears to have drawn much of its productivity from within the river itself. Aquatic organisms formed a dense and renewable resource, replenished through seasonal cycles that concentrated life into accessible channels. In this arrangement, plant consumption remained important, but it was not the dominant pathway through which energy flowed upward. The large herbivores that did exist would have occupied a different role, moving through areas where vegetation was sufficient to sustain them, yet always remaining peripheral to the central concentration of activity along the water. Their paths likely intersected with danger less frequently than the constant movement occurring within the river corridor, though when they did encounter it, the scale of the interaction would have been significant. As the layers of this environment align, a clearer structure emerges. Predators are numerous because their primary resource is not limited to the slower growth of land plants, but instead tied to a system capable of producing large quantities of biomass within relatively short periods. The herbivores that survive here do so either by existing at the margins of this system or by integrating themselves into it in ways that reduce vulnerability. This distribution shifts the balance away from the familiar patterns seen in many modern landscapes. The foundation is not rooted solely in vegetation spreading across open ground, but in a dynamic water network that gathers, concentrates, and redistributes life continuously. Every movement within this system traces back to that source, each survival strategy shaped by its presence. And then, within the record, that source ceases. Not through gradual retreat, but through a change marked clearly in the rock above, where one layer ends and another begins, preserving the moment when this entire arrangement was brought to a close. The change does not arrive as a sudden rupture, but as a slow alteration in balance, a shift that begins far from the river itself. In distant basins, the chemistry of the oceans begins to transform, oxygen levels falling across vast stretches of water. This period, now known as the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event, unfolds over time, yet its effects spread widely, touching both marine and terrestrial systems in ways that gradually reshape entire landscapes. As oxygen diminishes in the depths, the structure of the oceans changes, and with it, global sea levels begin to rise. Water expands across continental margins, advancing into regions that had long remained above its reach. The Tethys Ocean, once a distant influence feeding the northern edge of the river system, extends further inland, its boundary no longer fixed but steadily moving. The land here lies low, shaped over time by sediment and flow, without the elevation needed to resist this advance. Channels that once carried fresh water begin to feel the influence of encroaching salinity. Floodplains that supported dense life become increasingly unstable, their patterns disrupted as the incoming sea alters the rhythm that had governed them for so long. Gradually, the distinction between river and ocean fades. What had been a network of branching channels and seasonal currents becomes submerged beneath a broader, more uniform body of water. The transition is not marked by violence, but by persistence, the steady accumulation of change until the original system can no longer maintain its structure. This transformation is preserved in the rock. Above the layers that contain the remains of the river ecosystem lies a band of limestone deposited as the new shallow sea settled over the region. It forms a clear boundary, a visible division between two very different worlds. Below it, the record holds the traces of a complex, multi-layered environment. Above it, the signatures shift to those of marine conditions, reflecting a different set of processes and inhabitants. Within this boundary, the presence of familiar species ceases. Spinosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, Deltadromeus, each disappears from the local record at roughly the same interval. Their absence is not accompanied by a single moment of destruction, but by the gradual loss of the conditions that supported them. The spaces they occupied no longer exist in the same form, and the adaptations that once provided advantage no longer align with the transformed environment. Whether these animals vanished entirely or moved to regions where suitable conditions persisted remains uncertain. The fossil record offers only what has been preserved, and beyond this boundary, the continuity of their lineage becomes more difficult to trace. What is clear is that within this specific landscape, their presence comes to an end. The cause of this change differs from more familiar extinction events. There is no singular impact, no widespread layer of ash marking volcanic activity at the same scale. Instead, the driving force is the expansion of the sea itself, a process that advances steadily until the available land is reduced beyond what the existing ecosystem can support. In the stillness that follows, the former river lies beneath a shallow marine expanse, its channels filled, its seasonal rhythms dissolved into a more uniform system. The traces of its life remain locked within the layers below, a record of how a landscape can be reshaped not through sudden collapse, but through a gradual, unstoppable rise that leaves no ground untouched. Across northern Africa, scattered traces mark where this lineage once moved. Fragments embedded in rock from Egypt to Morocco, from Algeria to Tunisia, with possible remains extending even further south. These sites do not form a single continuous picture, but together they outline a distribution that spans a broad region, suggesting a presence that was not confined to one isolated system. Each fragment carries the same quiet implication that this animal existed across a landscape larger than any single river. There are also hints of connection beyond the continent. In what is now Brazil, within deposits of the Alcantara Formation, a partial skull was described under the name Oxalia quilombensis. Its features resemble those of North African spinosaurids, closely enough to suggest a shared ancestry. During the time these animals lived, the separation between Africa and South America had only recently begun, the distance between them still narrow compared to what it would become. Such proximity allows for the possibility that populations could disperse between these landmasses, their ranges overlapping across regions that are now divided by ocean. Beyond this single form, relatives of Spinosaurus appear in multiple parts of the world. Fossils attributed to the broader Spinosaurid group are known from Europe, Asia, and additional regions of South America. These animals vary in detail, yet they share a set of characteristics that point to a common evolutionary path, one that emphasizes interaction with aquatic environments. The pattern suggests that this way of life was not limited to a single species, but was instead a recurring solution that emerged in different places under similar conditions. Within this wider context, Spinosaurus aegyptiacus occupies a more specific position. Its remains are tied closely to a particular interval, and after that interval, the record falls silent. Following the environmental shift that transformed the delta system, no confirmed specimens appear in layers that postdate the event. The absence is notable not because it is sudden, but because it persists. While related forms continue elsewhere, this species does not reappear in any clearly identifiable form. The explanation may lie in the degree of specialization it had reached. Its structure reflects a close alignment with a particular environment, one shaped by shallow channels, seasonal flow, and an abundance of aquatic prey. Each anatomical feature supports this interpretation, forming a coherent system that functions effectively within that specific setting. When that setting changed, the advantages encoded within its body may have become limitations. Other members of its group, perhaps less tightly bound to a single type of habitat, could persist by occupying different environments or adjusting their behavior. Spinosaurus, by contrast, appears to have been closely tuned to one arrangement of conditions. The disappearance of that arrangement would therefore remove not only its preferred habitat, but the very framework within which its adaptations held meaning. What remains is a pattern that reflects both continuity and loss. The lineage continues through related forms in distant places, while the species itself fades from the record within the region where it once thrived. The river that shaped its existence no longer flows in the same way, and with that change, the presence that once depended on it is no longer observed. Even within this understanding, the story remains incomplete, shaped by fragments that may yet be revised as new material emerges from the rock. The outline appears complete at first glance, a sequence of discoveries arranged into a coherent picture, yet the details within that picture remain in motion. Each conclusion rests on evidence that is partial, each reconstruction shaped by material that arrived in fragments rather than in full. What seems stable is often provisional, held in place only until new data shifts its balance. One of the central uncertainties concerns the relationship between body form and behavior. The interpretation of Spinosaurus as an animal deeply adapted to life in water has been supported by multiple lines of evidence, yet not all analyses align in the same direction. A study published in 2022 revisited the proportions of its limbs, suggesting that earlier reconstructions may have emphasized certain features more strongly than the available material requires. This does not erase the aquatic interpretation, but it refines its boundaries, introducing a range of possibilities rather than a single fixed category. Questions also remain about how many distinct species are represented within the material from this region. Names such as Spinosaurus aegyptiacus and Spinosaurus moroccanus have both been applied to fossils from the same general deposits. Many researchers now consider these to belong to a single species, variations reflecting differences in preservation or individual development rather than separate lineages. Others remain cautious, noting that the available specimens are incomplete and that subtle distinctions could still indicate a more complex diversity. Another absence shapes the discussion in a quieter way. Juvenile individuals have not been clearly identified within the Kem Kem record. Without these early life stages, it becomes difficult to trace how the animal changed as it grew, or how its behavior may have shifted over time. The habitats used by younger individuals, the prey they targeted, and the risks they faced remain largely inferred rather than directly observed. The life cycle, like the skeleton itself, is reconstructed from pieces that do not yet form a continuous sequence. Beyond these scientific questions, there is a practical challenge that influences what can be known. Fossils from this region are often collected outside formal excavation, entering private markets before their context is recorded. When a specimen is removed without detailed documentation of its position within the rock, much of its informational value is lost. The bone remains, but its relationship to the surrounding environment becomes harder to determine, reducing the clarity of any conclusions drawn from it. Even with these limitations, each field season adds new material to the record. Researchers return to the exposed layers, tracing patterns in the sediment, comparing fragments, refining measurements. Small discoveries accumulate, sometimes reinforcing existing interpretations, sometimes introducing contradictions that require reevaluation. The process does not move in a straight line, but through adjustments that gradually reshape the overall understanding. What emerges is not a finished account, but an active one, continuously revised as new evidence is brought into view. The animal itself does not change, yet the way it is understood evolves, shaped by the methods and information available at any given moment. In this sense, the study of this ecosystem remains open, its details subject to refinement rather than closure. From this perspective, the question extends beyond the specifics of one species or one environment. It turns toward the methods that allow such reconstructions to exist at all, the ways in which fragments of bone and layers of rock are translated into a living system, assembled piece by piece from traces that have endured across vast spans of time. What remains in the rock is not the animal itself, but a translation of it, a record shaped by time, pressure, and chance. Bone becomes mineral, tissue gives way to structure, and what survives is altered yet still informative. The process that governs this transformation is studied through taphonomy, a field that traces how organisms move from living bodies into preserved forms. It considers how decay proceeds, how elements are scattered or buried, and how those fragments settle into layers that will one day be exposed again. Through this lens, patterns begin to emerge. The accumulation of teeth within a specific sediment, the alignment of bones within a channel deposit, the absence of certain elements where they might otherwise be expected, all contribute to a larger interpretation. These patterns reveal whether an animal lived within a place or merely passed through it, whether its remains were transported by water or settled close to where it fell. In this way, the distribution of material becomes a map of behavior, drawn not in motion but in residue. Beyond structure, the composition of the fossils themselves holds further information. Within the mineralized remains, subtle variations in isotopes of oxygen and carbon persist, ratios that reflect the conditions under which the animal lived. By measuring these ratios, scientists can infer aspects of temperature, humidity, and water chemistry, reconstructing elements of the surrounding environment. These signals are not visible to the eye, yet they remain encoded within the material, stable across immense spans of time. To examine what lies beneath the surface, another method is applied. Computed tomography, or CT scanning, allows the interior of a fossil to be visualized without altering it physically. Through this approach, differences in density become apparent, revealing how compact or porous a bone may be. Growth patterns can also be observed, subtle rings that indicate stages of development. Structures that would otherwise remain hidden are brought into view, expanding the range of information available from a single specimen. Interpretation does not rely on fossils alone. Comparative anatomy provides a bridge between extinct forms and living ones, allowing researchers to draw connections based on shared structures. When a feature in a fossil resembles one found in a modern animal with a known function, it offers a point of reference. Crocodilians, hippos, and birds, adapted to water, each provide partial analogs, their bodies offering clues that can be extended with caution to reconstruct the behavior of species no longer present. From these combined approaches, even a small fragment can yield a surprising depth of insight. A tooth, analyzed within its proper context, can indicate the type of prey consumed, the environment in which the animal lived, and aspects of its life history. Its wear patterns may suggest feeding habits, while its chemical composition reflects the water it encountered. Each detail contributes to a broader picture, assembled gradually from multiple lines of evidence. The material recovered from the Kem Kem beds functions in this way, not as isolated curiosities, but as interconnected data points. Each specimen carries information that extends beyond its immediate form, linking to others within the same layer and to the processes that shaped the entire system. As analytical techniques continue to develop, the capacity to extract meaning from these remains increases, revealing layers of detail that were once inaccessible. What appears at first as stone becomes, through careful study, a record of movement, interaction, and change. The landscape that produced these remains is no longer present in its original form, yet its structure can be reconstructed through the traces it left behind, each fragment contributing to an understanding that continues to evolve. Along the edge of the desert, the escarpment stretches in a long, broken line, its surface marked by wind, heat, and slow collapse. Each season alters it slightly. Fragments loosen, layers fracture, and what was once buried begins to emerge. The process is gradual, almost imperceptible from one day to the next. Yet over time, it reveals pieces of a much older world, carried outward from within the stone. Those who move across this landscape know where to look. Generations of local Moroccan fossil hunters have traced the contours of these exposures, reading subtle shifts in texture and color that indicate something preserved beneath. Their familiarity with the terrain allows them to find fragments that might otherwise remain unnoticed, small indications that lead to more significant discoveries. Many of the specimens that shape current understanding first passed through their hands, lifted from the surface before any formal expedition arrived. From there, the path of a fossil can diverge. Some are sold, entering private collections, or passing through markets where their origin becomes less certain. Others find their way into scientific study, accompanied by enough information to retain their context. Between these outcomes lies a tension that does not resolve easily. For local communities, fossil collecting can provide a necessary source of income. For researchers, context is essential, as the precise location and position of a find often carry as much meaning as the object itself. Despite this complexity, fieldwork continues. Teams return to the escarpment, guided both by earlier discoveries and by the knowledge held within the region. Excavations proceed carefully, layer by layer, documenting not only what is found, but how it is situated within the rock. Each detail contributes to a broader framework, allowing individual specimens to be connected into a coherent picture. The work is slow, shaped by heat, distance, and the limits of what can be transported and preserved. Above the fossil-bearing strata, a layer of limestone forms a protective cover. It rests like a quiet seal, shielding the sediments beneath from immediate erosion. Only when that cap is broken by natural forces or by deliberate excavation does the material below become exposed. This relationship between protection and exposure governs what is revealed and when, creating intervals in which entire sections remain hidden, waiting for the gradual processes of weathering to bring them into view. Even with ongoing exploration, only a fraction of the formation has been examined in detail. The escarpment that is visible represents a narrow window into a much larger expanse of rock that extends beneath the surrounding desert. Much of it remains inaccessible, either buried beneath shifting sands or located in regions difficult to reach. Within those unexamined layers, further remains persist, preserved in conditions similar to those already uncovered yet still beyond direct observation. Each newly revealed fragment adds to the archive, expanding the record without ever completing it. The landscape itself functions as a vast repository, holding information distributed across distance and depth. It does not release everything at once, but offers pieces gradually, shaped by the same processes that first concealed them. What is known emerges from this interplay between exposure and interpretation, between those who find and those who study. The archive remains incomplete, not because it lacks content, but because much of it still lies within the stone, awaiting the slow, patient forces that will eventually bring it into the light. There are moments in Earth's history when conditions align with a precision that is almost impossible to repeat. Not because any single element is rare, but because all of them must occur together in the same place, at the same time, sustained over long stretches of geological time. The system that formed along that ancient river belonged to such a moment, assembled from shifting continents, rising seas, and a chemistry that no longer exists in that exact form. The land itself was arranged differently then, not only in position but in relationship. Coastlines traced unfamiliar paths, shallow waters pressed inland, and currents moved through basins that have since been altered beyond recognition. To the north, a vast body of water extended its influence deep into the continent, feeding a network that carried nutrients across low ground and into channels that spread and reformed with each passing season. That connection shaped everything that followed, from the smallest organisms suspended in the water to the largest predators moving along its margins. Sea levels stood higher, allowing marine influence to reach far beyond present boundaries. With that came a constant exchange of material, minerals, and organic matter that enriched the system at its base. The chemistry of those waters supported an unusual productivity, one capable of sustaining large bodies in numbers that would seem disproportionate elsewhere. Modern rivers, though diverse and abundant, operate within different constraints, their inputs and cycles shaped by conditions that have shifted over millions of years. Across that span of time, life itself has continued to adapt, refining interactions through countless generations. Predators and prey have adjusted to one another in ways that stabilize their relationships, limiting extremes that might otherwise disrupt the balance. Speed, awareness, and defensive strategies have all advanced, creating systems where energy flows are more tightly regulated. In contrast, the earlier world allowed a different distribution, one where certain pathways expanded beyond what would later become typical. The abundance of aquatic life within that ancient network depended on more than simple availability of water. It relied on patterns of flooding and retreat, on seasonal pulses that concentrated resources and redistributed them across the landscape. These cycles created predictable concentrations of prey, supporting forms of specialization that would be difficult to maintain under modern conditions. No current river replicates that exact combination of timing, scale, and chemical input. Within such a framework, organisms could evolve into roles that no longer have an equivalent. A body adapted to move between submerged and exposed environments, sustained by prey of unusual size and abundance, required a setting that provided both opportunity and consistency. Without those factors, such a form would lack the support needed to persist. The absence of comparable prey alone would be enough to prevent it, as energy requirements at that scale demand a continuous and reliable source. What existed there was not simply an ecosystem in the usual sense, but a configuration shaped by a specific chapter of Earth's history. It followed patterns that held for a time, then shifted as conditions changed, leaving behind a record rather than a continuation. The processes that formed it have moved on, replaced by others that define the present. In this way, that river belongs entirely to its own era, a brief alignment of forces that cannot be reconstructed. Its absence today is not a loss of possibility, but a reflection of how the planet continues to change, carrying forward new systems while leaving others embedded in stone. In the long unfolding of life, certain forms stand apart, not because they are larger or more powerful, but because they follow a path that bends away from what came before. Among those forms, there are a few that seem almost improbable, as though shaped by a set of conditions so specific that their existence feels tied to a single place and time. This animal belongs to that category, a body drawn into alignment with its surroundings until the distinction between organism and environment begins to blur. Its lineage began along a more familiar route, within a group of predators, defined by movement across land, balanced on hind limbs, guided by senses tuned to terrestrial life. Over time, that inheritance shifted. The skull lengthened and narrowed, the teeth changed shape, the density of bone increased, and the proportions of the limbs altered. These changes did not occur in isolation. They unfolded together, each adjustment reinforcing the others, forming a system that moved steadily toward a different way of living. Such coordination requires more than variation. It reflects a process in which multiple traits evolve in concert, guided by pressures that favor a particular direction. The body becomes a network of interdependent features, where a change in one area influences the effectiveness of another. As this process continues, the organism becomes increasingly defined by its niche, shaped not by a single advantage, but by the cumulative effect of many small alignments. From this perspective, strength and speed are only part of the story. What determines success is how closely an organism matches the conditions it inhabits. When that match is precise, the result can appear extraordinary, as though the form has been designed for a specific purpose. In reality, it is the outcome of countless generations responding to consistent pressures, refining each element until the whole functions as a coherent system. Yet this precision carries a consequence. As specialization increases, flexibility decreases. A body adapted to one set of conditions may struggle to function outside them, its strengths becoming limitations when the environment shifts. The same features that allow it to thrive within a narrow range can restrict its ability to adjust when that range disappears. In this way, adaptation creates both capability and constraint, binding the organism to the stability of its surroundings. This relationship reveals a quiet paradox. The closer an organism comes to perfect alignment with its niche, the more dependent it becomes on that niche remaining unchanged. Success, in this sense, is not a final state, but a balance maintained over time. When the underlying conditions persist, the system holds. When they alter, even gradually, the balance can dissolve. Within the broader pattern of evolution, such outcomes are not unusual. Lineages expand into available spaces, refine their traits, and persist as long as those spaces remain. When the spaces close or transform, the forms that depended on them either adjust or vanish. The process continues, generating new combinations, new alignments, and new expressions of life. What remains is a record of these transitions, preserved not only in bones but in the relationships they imply. Each structure reflects a history of interaction between organism and environment, a dialogue carried out over immense spans of time. By tracing these patterns, it becomes possible to see how diversity emerges, not from a single direction, but from many paths branching and converging. In that sense, this animal offers more than an isolated example. It illustrates how evolution explores possibility, shaping forms that are as much a product of their surroundings as they are of their ancestry, each one a temporary solution within an ever-changing world. There are stretches of time so vast that they resist comparison, extending beyond the scale of memory or record. Within one of those stretches, a river moved across a low landscape, not briefly, but across millions of years, its presence steady enough to shape an entire world around it. The span of its existence exceeds the duration of human history by an amount that is difficult to hold in a single thought, a continuity that unfolded without interruption or awareness. Inside that long interval, life arranged itself according to patterns that needed no observer. Movements followed seasonal shifts, interactions formed stable relationships, and generations passed without leaving any trace of recognition beyond the marks embedded in sediment. The system did not require an audience. It existed entirely within itself, complete and self-contained, guided by forces that operated without reference to anything beyond the landscape that sustained them. Within that setting, a particular presence moved through water and along its edges, occupying a role that remained consistent across countless cycles. For a span that would seem almost immeasurable from a human perspective, it persisted without being named or described. No record marked its passage, no language captured its form. It existed fully, yet unnoticed, its life unfolding in a silence that would last far longer than its own time within the river. When its remains finally came to rest, they entered another kind of stillness. Layers accumulated above them, pressure altered their structure, and the world around them continued to change. For tens of millions of years, those fragments remained hidden, part of the ground itself, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. Their presence carried information, but that information remained inaccessible, waiting for conditions that would allow it to be revealed. The moment of rediscovery came much later, shaped by a chain of events that connected distant times, a fragment lifted from the rock, a set of observations recorded, an attempt to reconstruct what had once been. Yet, even then, the process was incomplete. Early discoveries were lost, erased by events unrelated to the life they represented, leaving behind only descriptions and images. What remained had to be rebuilt from partial records, each piece adding to a picture that could never be entirely whole. From that point onward, understanding grew slowly. New finds contributed additional details, methods improved, and interpretations shifted as more evidence came into view. Each step brought the reconstruction closer to the original form, yet always with the awareness that it remained a reconstruction assembled from fragments separated by immense spans of time. The clarity achieved was real, but it rested on a foundation that could never be fully restored. There is a quiet shift that comes with recognizing this distance. The most detailed account available is still shaped by absence, defined as much by what is missing as by what has been found. The gap between the living system and its present representation cannot be closed, only approached through careful inference and continuous revision. Placed against the duration of that river, the present appears differently. What seems stable reveals itself as brief. What feels complete shows its limits. The river, in its long existence and silent persistence, reflects not only a past world, but the scale against which all current understanding is measured. A reminder carried forward in stone and slowly brought back into view. Numbers can describe time, but they rarely convey its scale. 100 million years sits beyond ordinary intuition, a span that stretches past memory, past written history, into durations that resist direct comparison. It can be stated, measured, and repeated, yet it remains abstract until placed against something familiar, where its magnitude begins to take form. If the entire history of life were gathered into a single day, its earliest traces would appear in the first faint hours before dawn. Complex forms would emerge gradually, filling the long daylight with change and diversification. Within that compressed cycle, the presence of this river system would occur late, within the closing portion of the day, already nearing its end. Human existence, by contrast, would arrive only in the final seconds, a brief flicker before midnight. During the time when that river persisted, the surrounding world differed in ways that are not immediately visible but deeply significant. Plant life had not yet taken on its modern structure, and the landscapes that would later be defined by grasses remained unformed. The skies lacked familiar shapes, and the small mammals that moved through shaded ground had not yet expanded into the forms that would follow much later. It was a complete system, yet one that operated under conditions distinct from those that now seem ordinary. The land itself has not remained fixed. Over immense spans, continents shift, carrying with them the records of what once occurred upon their surfaces. The ground that supported that ancient system has traveled across the planet, repositioned by forces that act slowly yet persistently. What was once level terrain has been lifted, tilted, and exposed, transforming horizontal layers into vertical faces that now stand against open sky. Within those exposed surfaces, traces remain. Sediment that once lay beneath moving water has hardened into stone, preserving impressions of movement, interaction, and presence. Wind now passes across it, removing grains over time, revealing fragments that had remained hidden. Each exposed layer represents not only a place, but a moment within a sequence that unfolded far beyond immediate perception. Seen from this perspective, the present occupies a narrow interval. It rests upon layers that have already formed and precedes layers that have yet to exist. The ground beneath is a record of what has passed, while above, the future remains unwritten, waiting for processes that will eventually leave their own marks. This position, between what is preserved and what will be, defines the current moment in a way that becomes clearer when viewed against deep time. The sense of scale does not diminish what came before. Instead, it places it within a broader context where each period contributes to a continuous sequence. The river that once flowed, the organisms that depended on it, and the structures they left behind all belong to that sequence, connected to the present through layers of transformation. In this way, deep time does not reduce significance. It expands it, revealing how each moment fits within a larger framework. The present becomes part of an ongoing process, one that will continue to reshape the surface and preserve its own record. The layers that will one day form from what exists now remain unlaid, part of a future archive that will be read in its own time, long after the current moment has passed into stone. Nothing of that river moves anymore. The channels that once carried its currents have been filled, lifted, and reshaped into forms that no longer resemble flowing water. The sea that once fed it has withdrawn into a different configuration, its boundaries redrawn across the globe. The animals that moved within that system, each one adapted to its particular place, have long since disappeared, leaving no living descendants that mirror their forms. What remains is quieter, but no less present. A cliff face stands where layers have been exposed, its surface marked by bands of color and texture that record transitions across time. Within those layers, fragments endure, not arranged as they once were, but preserved enough to retain meaning. A tooth here, a bone there, each one separated from its original context, yet still connected through the structure of the rock that surrounds it. Some of these pieces have been carried far from where they formed. They rest now in controlled spaces, studied under careful conditions, their surfaces examined for details that reveal patterns of growth, movement, and interaction. Others remain where they were found, still embedded in stone, part of a larger record that has yet to be fully uncovered. Between these locations, the story is assembled gradually, each edition refining what is already known. The form that moved through that water did not dominate by force alone. Its presence was defined by alignment, a body shaped in such a way that it occupied a space no other organism could fill in the same manner. This alignment allowed it to persist across long intervals, maintaining its role as long as the surrounding conditions remained stable. It did not need to replace others, only to exist within the niche it had come to match so precisely. When those conditions shifted, that alignment could no longer hold. The environment that had supported it transformed, removing the framework that had made its existence possible. Without that framework, the traits that once ensured success became insufficient. The disappearance that followed was not sudden in a single moment, but inevitable once the balance had been altered beyond recovery. Time continued beyond that transition, moving through new configurations, forming new systems that replaced what had been lost. The river endured longer than any individual organism within it, yet it too eventually ceased, leaving behind only the record of its presence. The remains of those that lived there persisted longer still, preserved in a medium that would outlast both water and flesh. Even those remains, however, are subject to change, as erosion gradually releases them into the open. What persists the longest is the stone itself, holding within it the layered memory of events that unfolded across vast durations. It does not present the story all at once. Instead, it reveals it slowly, through exposure and interpretation, requiring patience to understand what has been left behind. Beneath the surface that is visible now, more remains are still enclosed, protected by the same processes that preserved what has already been found. These hidden portions are not separate from the known record, but extensions of it, waiting within the same continuity of rock. Their eventual discovery will add to the existing picture, though it will never complete it entirely. The river, in its absence, leaves a trace that extends beyond its own existence. It remains present through the structures it shaped, the organisms it sustained, and the record embedded within the ground. That trace endures, not as a living system, but as a quiet archive, continuing to offer its fragments to those who seek to understand it.